so let's go through this quiz. We're going to spend at least the first hour on this today. Maybe longer because it is quite detailed. Maybe you guys can let me know in chat. Did you find this? If you found this straightforward, if I hope that everybody just did it by instinct as well, rather than calculation. And now we'll go through using Holden Resources Calculator, and we'll look at the actual ranges. Okay. So while I'm not going to read out what ranges other people put, I am going to give an idea of the variety of ranges that people wrote, just to give you an idea of the variety of responses we've had. So I'm just going to keep these up on my other monitor from the 5 of you. So we'll just do this one at a time, okay? So the first question was 10 big blinds effective, blind be blind. Oh, I'm sorry, for some reason this repeats itself. It should be, as I'm sure you did assume, versus unknowns. Every spot is versus unknowns, of course. So it's like, what is our default in this type of spot? We assume they are average players in whatever games we normally play. Yeah, thanks, Michael. I just read your post, and Peter. Yeah, great. So just using instincts and only using range calculators to display the ranges, not to actually calculate them. Yeah, that sounds fine. Okay. So, sorry, I have a problem with my other monitor. It keeps disappearing, these ranges that I put up of yours. Okay, there we go. So just to show you the variety of responses I've had from you guys, some people have given much more detailed ranges than others. So some have just said like the worst hand, the worst suited connector they would play. And generally I've got a lot of people saying, any ace, any pair, quite a, any king, and yeah, quite wide ranges. But they do differ. They do differ a fair amount. Okay, so yeah, that's all I'll say about that for now. Let's look at the actual numbers. So 10 effective, blind v blind. We're assuming, we're assuming full ring, right? So and we have got antes. So let's put what's common for stars, which is 12.5 antes. So 500, 1000, 125 antes. I'm just going to move these notepads around one more time so I can see them and your comments in chat as well, so you can post anytime any questions. Okay, so let's put, and the first question was 10 effective here, so let's just give it 9-handed. Oops, we'll give it 9-handed. Everyone's got 10 bigs. 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. And we'll just run a simulation. We'll then play with the ranges a little bit, and I'll ask you some questions as we go. But all these calculations should be pretty quick in HRC. They do take a moment to run, but they should be pretty quick because we're mainly just calculating push-fold. And I'm just going to ask you to help me redefine the calling ranges a little bit in some cases. I guess the shallower we are, the less we're going to need to do that. So we're just looking at button. The only reason I've listed the other players is so that there are antes listed correctly. But we're just looking at button. Sorry, in this case we're just looking at blind v blind, in fact. So small blind shoving into big blind. Okay. So this, first of all, this is the Nash ranges. These are the Nash ranges. So assuming that big blind is calling off perfectly, and we want any edge, we can shove close to 73%. However, I don't think this is really accurate that big blind is necessarily going to call off this wide. I would like to ask you what you think. So let's have a look at this first of all. Now, if we say first of all, okay, but big blind will want some kind of edge to call off. He'll want at least 1% or something. It actually hardly changes because almost all of these had that anyway. We take out queen 3 off, for example, and 8-9 off, but very little else changes. But let me ask you first of all, in the stakes that you're currently playing, do you think that the average villain is calling off this wide, blind v blind, 10 effective? You can answer in chat, you can answer in microphone, whatever you like. No. Okay. So let's get someone on chat in microphone to tell me what do you think I should take out. Any volunteers? Anybody want to speak? Or I can invite you to speak. Um, Peter, why don't you help us out here? Why don't you click your microphone icon and tell us what you think is the bottom of this calling range? Peter's typing. Maybe his mic is not working. Oh, it's disabled. So you can try clicking the icon to make it green in the Adobe, or maybe some other problem at your end. Okay, so Michael.
I would take.
Oh,
Yeah,
Alex. Yeah, go ahead.
yeah. I can't hear myself talking. My speakers work, but my speakers and my mic work. So that's why I can't hear myself talk.
We hear you.
Okay. I would take out Jack 4, Jack 5, Jack 6. Some people might call it Jack 9 suited, maybe. I would take out up to King 5 off. I would leave King 6 off in. And I would up to Queen 8 off. That might even be a little bit too wide for some
Hmm.
people, but up to I would leave Jack 9 off in, and take out 10-8 off, and leave in 10-8 suited.
Yeah. Okay. So and maybe like this, something like this.
Yeah, and that might even be a little too loose for some players. But
Hmm.
yeah, up to Queen 6 suited, and then I will leave everything else in.
Okay. Peter's saying he thinks they usually would call the King X. I think it's debatable, but I think we could leave the King X in, yeah. At least most of it. But it depends how bad they are, right? And what about 10-9 off? Do you think people call off with that? 10 effective? I'm thinking probably
It
not.
yeah.
Yeah, it depends, right? But I honestly think we could go even tighter here, and debatable on the weakest kings. I think with 10 bigs. But I think this looks pretty reasonable, and it's quite an adjustment from 55%, right, down to 39%. I mean, that's quite a big jump. So people are not calling anywhere near, as far as we believe, people are not calling anywhere near correct or so-called game theory optimal. So once we make that adjustment, then we can go actually any two, funnily enough, when people are not calling off correctly. And even if we put an edge requirement of 1%, it's still any two. And if we're worried they're calling closer to Nash, then as we saw, we can go the original range, which was 73%. Yeah. So we can actually go somewhere between. Now, what we're going to do today, we're not going to list we're not going to list all the adjusted ranges. We'll list Nash, and then we'll note in our mind that we should go wider than Nash in many, many situations. I just wanted to show you quite how much wider we can go even when we make that adjustment. So let's say, okay, what if we say, okay, let's give the guy the benefit of the doubt. Let's have him calling off a little wider. Um, let's leave in all the King X, and let's leave in a little bit of this. This is still like 10% tighter. Then we don't want to go like any old edge. We want to go like 0.1 big blinds. Then it's like 92%. Okay, which is pretty damn wide, obviously. So again, it's minimum 73. Now, the other thing we might say is, okay, but hang on, what if I'm sometimes inducing? What if I'm not shoving these? Which, versus a fish, you might induce, right? You might induce quite a lot. What if I'm inducing and therefore my range is weaker? And the answer to that is it won't matter because they're not adjusting to you. They're not adjusting to that. And this is obviously showing not just how the range does against the range, but how each holding does against their calling range. So it's not going to matter. They're not going to call you off wider just because they think you're capped. Fish don't think like that. Even regulars don't really adjust for that. So the answer is basically we can go anywhere between 73%, which I'll put in here, and this would be the Nash adjusted for edge requirement. Okay, so we adjusted for the fact that we wanted at least this edge. This is just an arbitrary number. Of course, we might say we want more edge, but still it would be pretty wide. And then we can go up to like 95 to 100% depending on what our edge requirement is in this exact spot. And this, of course, is with, I'm going to put 12.5% up here as well for antes, because if it was 10% antes, then it's rarer that we'd go any two, even into confirmed fish or nits. We'd probably go closer to 90, but it would still be pretty wide. Okay, so some of you will be more surprised than others to read that based on what I saw from some of your answers so far. But you can probably see that you can go a lot wider than you thought if you put a tighter range. Okay, so let's run the numbers on 7 effective. And obviously we can extrapolate from this that it's going to be pretty darn wide. But we'll run the straight Nash numbers now. We won't do all the adjustments. We'll just see how the Nash is looking. Because if we do all the adjustments every time, we'll be here way too long. But I want to give you an idea of how much it should change from Nash. So we'll discuss it a little bit as we go. Okay. So of course I'm not suggesting you have to go any two, because I'm not suggesting you have to shove your monster hands necessarily. I tend to do it quite a lot into good players, because I think when I'm 10 effective, they'll actually often perceive me as weaker when I do that. But that's another story. So because often in these stakes we're just playing against bad players. Okay, so 7 effective blind v blind. If we assume that they're only calling if they're making at least like well, let's say at least again at least 1%. They're calling off like this, and then we say we want at least a similar edge for at least like 1% of stacks. It's 78.6%. Okay, so that's the Nash adjusted for edge. Okay, and as you can imagine, if we just tighten them up a little bit, we can go closer to any two. Although I think the shallower we get, the less likely it will be that we deviate that much from Nash in the calling range, that they like go super tight. But I do think that people tend to fold these offsuit hands pretty readily, like Jack 3 off, even for 7 effective. So it's pretty astonishing quite how wide we can go versus a wide enough shoving range, actually, how wide we can call off when we're shallow. I don't think people do it. So we probably would narrow him at least a bit on these hands. Like I said, we won't do it all now, but we'd narrow him a bit on these holdings, and then it would be easily in the 80s or 90s, yeah, if not 100%. Serjan asked, do you min raise with aces and kings? Sometimes I'll min raise with like mid pairs too in that spot. It just depends on the dynamic and how I expect them to read it. If they read it as fancy play from me, that I'm actually doing it with some bet folds and they can jam wide, then it's okay. If they're just spewy, I'll give them a chance to spew. Alex is talking about open limping with the monsters. That's definitely fine too. There are all these kind of adjustments we can make, and there are special adjustments we can make even when shallow. But all I'm trying to do is lay the groundwork, talking through what is solid push fold, and then of course there are always going to be exceptions to that as well that we can also speak about later on. But yeah, I agree. I think, Alex, versus a bad player, I would generally limp really shallow with the big hands, blind v blind, but I would tend to, or even wider than aces and kings, but I would tend to rip into a better player. Because I think they'll smell a rat quite often when I limp that shallow if they're decent at hand reading.